Steve Osunsami with FBI video tonight of the killer's chilling confessions.
Samuel Little, once considered the most prolific serial killer in U.S. history, evaded capture for decades, leaving a trail of unsolved murders across the country.
North Little Rock. Tell me what that girl looked like.
Oh man, I loved her.
His crimes spanned from the 1970s to the 2000s, and he was responsible for the deaths of at least 8 known victims, although investigators believe his real body count may be much higher. What makes his case unique isn't just the brutal killings, but the unexpected twist that came years after his conviction.
She was like partially concealed by vegetation.
Little provided chilling, accurate details about his murders,
She fighting for her life, fighting for my pleasure.
including descriptions of victims he had never been publicly connected to, leading to the discovery of even more cold cases he had left behind. But the last clue that exposed the full extent of his terror came when Little, in his later years, drew sketches of his victims, revealing a hidden pattern that would finally link him to the crimes and lead to his ultimate downfall. Samuel McDowell, later known as Samuel Little, was born on June 7, 1940, in Reynolds, Georgia. His childhood was a chaotic and unstable one, marked by neglect and abuse, factors that would ultimately shape the man he became. Raised primarily by a mother who frequently sent him to foster care, Little's early experiences lacked the emotional support and guidance that most children need to thrive. He was one of several children, and his family life was marred by poverty and dysfunction. Little himself later reflected on his troubled upbringing, acknowledging the harsh realities that shaped his worldview. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, Little's early exposure to violence began with his mother's frequent absences and a string of emotionally turbulent foster placements. These formative years set the tone for the years that followed. His relationship with his mother was described as distant and strained, and he harbored resentment towards her for her inability to provide a stable home. Little's sense of alienation only deepened, and he began to develop a pattern of behavioral problems that would later manifest in his adult life. By the time he reached his late teens, Samuel Little was already beginning to show signs of criminal behavior. He committed his first known crimes as a young man, engaging in petty theft and minor offenses. As his criminal activity escalated, so did the severity of his actions. In his 20s, he was arrested on multiple occasions for offenses ranging from assault to armed robbery. Little's tendency to gravitate toward violence was evident, but his true nature as a serial killer would not become apparent for years. Throughout the 1960s and early 1970s, Little's criminal record grew, but he managed to avoid long-term imprisonment. Despite his increasing encounters with law enforcement, his ability to charm those around him helped him evade serious consequences. Little was a master of manipulation, using his charisma to deflect suspicion and gain the trust of those who would ultimately become his victims. It was not until the early 1970s that his crimes would begin to take a more deadly turn. The first confirmed murder that Little committed occurred in 1970, although the full extent of his criminal activity would remain hidden for decades. His choice of victims was both deliberate and calculated. Little preyed on vulnerable women, often those who were marginalized by society. Many of his victims were sex workers, drug addicts, or women living on the fringes of society, whose disappearances were frequently dismissed or overlooked by law enforcement. Little knew that these women were less likely to be reported missing or receive the attention of authorities, allowing him to continue his reign of terror without drawing suspicion. His modus operandi was chilling in its simplicity. Little would often target women in isolated areas, using his charm and persuasive demeanor to lure them into his grip. Once in control, he would strangle his victims, a method he perfected over time, ensuring that his killings were carried out in a way that minimized evidence. He would dispose of the bodies in remote, hidden locations, making it difficult for authorities to connect the murders. For years, Little remained undetected, evading capture despite the growing number of women whose bodies were discovered in his wake. Little's ability to avoid detection for so long was due in part to his careful selection of victims. His targets were often women with few ties to the community, leaving little trace of their disappearance. Moreover, the authorities often failed to link the deaths to a single perpetrator. partly because many of the cases were classified as drug overdoses or homicides unrelated to serial murder. Little's killing spree continued, growing in scope and brutality, yet the law enforcement agencies responsible for investigating the deaths were unable to identify a pattern. It wasn't until the 1980s that Little's actions began to attract more serious attention. By this time, he had developed a disturbing confidence in his ability to evade justice. However, the investigation into his crimes remained fragmented, and it would take decades before his true identity as a serial killer was finally revealed. In total, Little was linked to the deaths of over 80 women. Though he was only convicted of 3 murders during his lifetime, Samuel Little's rise to infamy highlights the dark intersection of systemic neglect, personal trauma, and the vulnerability of marginalized individuals in society. His early life, marked by a lack of nurturing and emotional stability, set the stage for the violent path he would ultimately follow. Through his manipulation and calculated predation, Little became one of the most prolific serial killers in American history, leaving a trail of victims that would only come to light long after his crimes had been committed. Samuel Little's killing spree, which would span nearly 3 decades, began with a brutal act of violence in 1970 in Miami, Florida. His first known victim was a woman whom he strangled and left in a dark alley. At the time, the police treated the crime as an isolated incident, with no immediate leads or clues to suggest a serial killer was at work. The case quickly went cold, as Little's methods were still unrefined, and the murder seemed like the random act of a killer with no specific pattern. However, what initially appeared as an isolated killing would soon evolve into something far more sinister. Throughout the 1970s and into the 1980s, Little's crimes escalated in both frequency and brutality. He began to refine his approach, making his killings more deliberate and calculated. His typical method involved picking up women, often those who were marginalized or involved in sex work, and engaging them in casual conversation. Once the victim felt comfortable, Little would overpower her, strangle her to death, and then dump her body in remote or secluded locations, typically areas where the bodies were unlikely to be discovered quickly. During the 1980s and 1990s, Little's killings became more widespread. He committed murders across several states, including California, Ohio, and Florida, leaving a trail of bodies in his wake. Each of these women was chosen for her vulnerability. Many were homeless, drug-addicted, or involved in prostitution, which made them easy targets for Little's predatory behavior. Because of their lifestyle, the disappearances often went unnoticed or were dismissed by authorities as routine cases of overdoses or accidental deaths. Little's ability to avoid capture for so long was due in part to his ability to blend into his surroundings. Unlike other serial killers who may have had more distinctive traits or patterns, Little was inconspicuous and never attracted the attention of law enforcement. His ability to remain undetected was aided by the fact that the majority of his victims were from transient populations.
Grab her by the legs and pull her to the water. That's the only one that I ever killed by drowning.
Making it difficult for police to establish clear connections between the murders. The women were often discarded in truck stop areas, alleys, or other places where they would be overlooked. These environments, known for housing people who were often overlooked by society, became the perfect hunting grounds for Little. Moreover, Little was not considered a typical serial killer by investigators at the time. He did not fit the usual profile of a killer with a clear, identifiable modus operandi. His victims were not always murdered in the same manner, nor were they typically linked to one specific geographic area. This lack of consistency in his killings led many investigators to believe that the deaths were unrelated. Consequently, Little avoided suspicion for years, his name never surfacing in the investigative databases as a potential suspect. In the absence of a clear pattern or connection between the cases, the murders continued largely unchecked. By the time Little was finally apprehended in 2012, it was clear that the true scale of his crimes was far greater than anyone had initially realized. He had managed to evade detection for decades, and the true extent of his violence would only come to light as DNA and other forensic technologies advanced in later years, eventually linking him to dozens of cold cases that had remained unsolved for years. Samuel Little was apprehended in 2012, not for his notorious murders, but for an assault charge in Kentucky. It was during a routine check that authorities discovered his violent past, linking him to several unsolved cold cases. However, at the time of his arrest, investigators had no idea they had captured one of the most prolific serial killers in US history. The investigation into Little's past was slow but methodical. Detectives began to delve into his criminal history and soon realized they were dealing with someone much more dangerous than an ordinary violent offender. They connected him to a series of unsolved homicides across the country. But it wasn't until 2014 that they made a key breakthrough. Authorities decided to test Little's DNA against evidence from a 1984 murder in Los Angeles, and the results were shocking. Samuel Little was a match. This discovery was pivotal, but the investigation didn't end there. In the years following his arrest, Little's cooperation with law enforcement became critical in piecing together his crimes. While his admissions were often cryptic, he provided crucial details that only the killer could know, offering chilling insights into his methods and his victims. Over time, he began to describe his victims in greater detail, revealing the full extent of his killing spree. Little's confession would later result in the identification of over 90 victims, many of whom had remained nameless for decades. His capture and subsequent cooperation helped law enforcement unravel the true scale of his violent career, making him one of the most infamous serial killers in history. As the investigation into Samuel Little's past continued, his confessions became increasingly unsettling. While most serial killers attempt to hide their identities or obscure the details of their crimes, Little's admissions were disturbingly precise. He provided detailed descriptions of his victims, details that were never publicly released or documented. Little accurately described their physical appearance, the clothing they wore, and most chillingly, the exact locations where their bodies had been discarded. His ability to recall these details with such precision was both shocking and invaluable to investigators, helping to solve numerous cold cases that had eluded law enforcement for decades. What made Little's confessions even more disturbing was the fact that he described murders that had not yet been discovered. As he spoke to investigators, he detailed women he had killed in various states, leading authorities to realize that Little had been traveling across the country, leaving a trail of victims in his wake. His killings spanned multiple decades and states, including California, Florida, Ohio, and more. His movements suggested that Little had been actively evading detection for years, committing murders in different locations and often choosing secluded areas to dispose of the bodies. The depth of Little's knowledge was chilling. He spoke about cases where the bodies had been discarded in places so remote or obscure that investigators had never considered them as crime scenes. As detectives cross-referenced his statements with unsolved cases, many of his confessions were verified, confirming that he had indeed committed the murders he described. Little's twisted confessions not only revealed the full extent of his crimes, but also offered closure to many families who had long been left in the dark about their loved ones' disappearances. In the final years of his life, Samuel Little provided one more twist to the investigation. He began to sketch portraits of his victims. These sketches would prove to be the last clue that connected him to his widespread killing spree. In 2018, Little's drawings were made public, and investigators were shocked to see how accurately he depicted the faces of his victims. These drawings were not just sketches, they were detailed, hauntingly accurate representations of the women he had killed. Little's ability to recall their appearances, even after so many years, revealed a disturbing pattern. Many of the women he had murdered were never reported missing or were dismissed as low-priority cases. The sketches helped identify several of Little's victims, and more importantly, they allowed investigators to piece together the full scope of his murders. While Little had been apprehended for several of the murders, these drawings revealed dozens more victims, some of whom had been long forgotten by the public. Samuel Little's confessions, coupled with detailed victim sketches he provided, led to a steadily increasing list of murders attributed to him. While he was convicted of 3 murders in 2014, Little's own claims were far more chilling. He insisted that he had killed up to 93 women across the United States. Although many of these claims remain unverified, the FBI has acknowledged the possibility that his body count could be closer to his stated number than originally thought. Investigators have worked tirelessly to validate Little's confessions. cross-referencing his detailed descriptions with unsolved homicides and missing persons reports. Many of his victims were never officially connected to him, as his killings often went undetected for years, buried under the circumstances surrounding the women's lifestyles. His ability to blend in with transient populations and target vulnerable women made it easier for him to evade suspicion. As of 2020, law enforcement had confirmed that Little was responsible for at least 8 murders, with many more still under investigation. Some of these cases involved bodies that were found in obscure, remote locations, places law enforcement might not have considered if not for Little's admissions. His confessions helped uncover a pattern of killings spanning multiple states and decades, revealing a chilling snapshot of a serial killer who managed to remain largely unnoticed for most of his life. Despite the confirmations, the true extent of Little's crimes may never be fully understood. His ability to avoid detection for so long, coupled with the number of cold cases he helped solve, has left a lasting impact on the field of criminal investigations, reshaping how authorities approach serial murder cases and missing persons reports. Samuel Little died in 2020 at the age of 80, having lived a long life despite his brutal crimes. He died in prison while serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole. His death marked the end of a reign of terror that lasted more than 4 decades. Little's case remains a chilling example of how serial killers can evade justice for years, sometimes decades, until new investigative methods, such as DNA testing and forensic artistry, finally bring them to light. His confessions, which were often too precise to dismiss as mere fantasy, have led to the closure of numerous cold cases. In this sense, Little's twisted legacy is paradoxical. Though he is one of the most infamous serial killers in American history, his admissions helped solve crimes that would otherwise have remained unsolved. Samuel Little's story serves as a haunting reminder of the dark side of human nature and the capacity for evil that can sometimes lurk in plain sight. His ability to evade capture for so long and his detailed confessions leave an indelible mark on the criminal justice system, offering both closure and new questions. The final clue, the sketches of his victims, was the key that unlocked the full extent of his killing spree, and it is likely that the true scope of his crimes may never be fully known. In the end, Samuel Little's name will forever be linked to the phrase, the most prolific serial killer in US history. But it's the last clue, the haunting sketches, that will remain etched in the minds of those who followed the case, a chilling reminder of the darkness that can exist within a single individual. If you found this story gripping and want to learn more about the darkest corners of criminal history, don't forget to subscribe for more chilling tales and true crime insights. Stay tuned for more in-depth analysis and updates on the cases that continue to haunt us all.